This is going to be a very long video, and I can't wait to have to edit, but I want to make a video about the comp my group uses to kill bosses in 10 to 20 seconds. This is not just a tank build video, as the tank isn't the only thing that's required. All 4 players need to be coordinating for this to work, so yeah. But let's start with the tank build itself. For the tank subclassing, we want to look at what buffs we need, and what buffs we can give with certain skill trees. The first skill tree we want to look at is Earthenheart. Earthenheart is a DK line that gives 2 buffs we really care about. The first comes from the passive Mountain's Blessing. This gives us a unique buff, Minor Brutality. The only way to get this buff is through the Mountain's Blessing passive, and it is pre-buffable. Mountain's Blessing, when cast with either the Stomp of Stone Giant or something like Eruption, allows us to get the buff up as a pre-buff and not really have to worry about it during the fight. The second buff we gain is, well, Stagger. The problem with Stagger is it's a 3 GCD cast, and in fights like this, 3 GCDs is just a lot of time and it won't be our highest priority. We will put it up eventually though. This just comes down to the buff isn't large enough to prioritize it over other things and wasting 3 GCDs instead of something else. As for the rest of Earthenheart's skills and passives, we don't really use much of it. Igneous Weapon doesn't matter, as the DPS will be using skills that give them the brutality and sorcery. Igneous Shield is just a weaker version of a shield we'll be taking, and the rest of the actives are kind of just useless. The passives fall under the same boat. Eternal Mountain is nice to make Eruption last longer, so it does a little bit more damage during the entire fight. But other than that, things like Battle Roar does nothing for us, and Helping Hands gives us sustain we'll never actually need. As for the second skill tree we'll be taking Soldier of Apocrypha for 2 main reasons. A specific active skill that decreases our GCDs by 1, and just the overall tankiness that Soldier of Apocrypha provides. Let's start off by talking about the active skill, Colorless Pool. Ring of the Colorless Pool provides Minor Brittle and Minor Vuln for 20 seconds, effectively allowing us to cast it once in a fight and never having to worry about these buffs ever again. One thing to note, we can get these debuffs from other sources, however, this skill is nice because they're both on 1 and we don't have to cast anything else. It is also nice to have this skill because the buffs last a long time. If you were to use something like Elisus to get these buffs, you would end up having to cast Elisus a lot during the fight. And for reasons later you'll see, you cannot get Elisus to proc Minor Brittle anyway. As for the second reason we take this line, it's just very tanky. If a burn is slightly longer, we can drop a skill for something like Rune Guard and gain the armor from Aegis of the Unseen passive, and well, just a gigantic shield. We also gain access to Minor Evasion, and while not all that helpful with how fast the fight should be, if for whatever reason the fight does have a lot of AoE damage at the start, it will help the DPS just kind of face tank the damage and keep beaming. Finally, we get to the last skill tree, Winter's Embrace. This is by far the most flexible line out of all of them that we have. However, the tankiness it provides with passives and the group Major Resolve is just super nice for almost any part of a dungeon outside of the bosses. This is the main reason we take this line, as the group Major Resolve is kind of insane and it just helps DPS keep doing damage if the boss does end up doing some group-wide damage before you can kill him. With Winter's Embrace, we also gain access to some heals and some pre-buff dots, as well as a couple of other things that are really nice to have. First, let's talk about the pre-buff dot. We gain Winter's Revenge. It's just a ground AoE which we can switch off of our bar and just have damage out at the beginning of fights. Though, realistically, we will probably never actually use it. Other than that, we have access to what is probably the best tank self-heal in the game, with Polar Wind giving us a massive upfront heal and a pretty good hot afterwards. Other than the active skills mentioned, there really isn't much else we can get out of this from the active skills. There are some fights where pre-placing gates can be funny because you can drag the ads that spawn in and actually kill them instead of letting them plink DPS, but other than that, there's not really a use for the gates. This is by far the easiest subclass to replace if you want to go for raw damage, which I'll go over right now. For options that we can replace skill lines with, we have a couple. One of them is just funny and one of them is more really just suited towards speedrunning. Starting off with the funny option, let's talk about Dawn's Wrath. This isn't actually a good idea, but it's a meme thing, and while testing it, it was kind of funny. It's just, yeah, you take it because it's funny. This should only ever really be taken if you know for a fact that the boss will not kill you by casting something very stupid and making you block, because the second you block, there's really no point to running this because you can't beam and block at the same time. Storm Calling is up next, and it's a replacement for Winter's Embrace. If you want slightly more damage for yourself, Hurricane and Lightning Flood are very strong dots, and Conduit is an extremely strong synergy. Lightning Flood is pre-buffable, and if your DPS aren't insane and don't spam their synergies, it just adds more damage to the boss while it's stacked. Hurricane is kind of pre-buffable, however, it competes with your very limited bar space. If you want to pre-buff it, it's one of these skills that has to stay on your bar. This basically just means that on your actual boss fight bar, you have to have this skill on and you'll lose something you'll likely want. The passives are also kind of nice, having a reverse execute. This will be more important later, but you as a tank do damage, and your damage does matter a bit more than you think. We're not pulling any insane numbers like 100k or anything, but doing 30 to 50k for the first little bit of the fight helps your DPS more than you would think. The whole point of most of the recent nukes where bosses have a bit more health isn't to outright down the boss instantly, it's to make sure that the first or second beam puts the boss into execute because of the damage fall off we'll get near the end of our burst window. So at the end of the day, really any extra damage you can do as a tank is helpful, and with subclassing your damage actually went down a little bit because you just don't have access to the offensive skills you'd want because of the buffs you gained access to. As for the next part, we probably have the longest part for the tank as there's just a lot of stuff to go over. But let's start off with 5-piece sets. For a tank, there's really only 3 options to pick from, 4 if you're a masochist. Starting off, let's talk about Major Courage. Olarim and SPC are our best options for this buff, and well, SPC just isn't happening. You're a tank and you really aren't running a heal, so you're never going to really be proccing this set. So with that being said, Olarim it is. Olarim forces you to place an AoE on the ground that ends up spawning a small circle. All your DPS have to do is look for the circle and stand in it. But Major Courage is the strongest buff we can apply with a 5-piece set, and it's not absolutely aids to proc. The only tip I can give for the set is just don't place the circle inside of an AoE, or do. Now let's talk about the second set you'll be using. There's 2 options here. One is really strong, but it's also horrid to use, and let's start with that one. Martial Knowledge. This is a very strong set, but it does 2 things. One, it forces you into 2 light sets, which on its own is pretty awful. But also, the proc itself is bad in 2 ways. It's not long enough for some of the nukes that we do, which have a little bit more health. And also, playing at 50% stamina as a tank at default is just really annoying with how you're set up. Instead, we can look at the slightly lowered burst damage option, but a lot more consistent, and the buff lasts a lot longer. Powerful Assault. PA is by far a lot more consistent, and it's extremely easy to proc using only 1 skill cast. This makes it better for some of the nukes where you don't actually end up killing within the window that you have set up, and it just keeps your damage up for a longer period of time. This is how I set up my character. I end up using Olarim on weapons and PA on armor, and the other reason is I don't want 2 full light sets because that would just suck because we're using a light chest no matter what. Speaking of a light set on the chest piece, everyone knows where this is going, but it's Crypt Cannon. If you don't know why we're using Crypt Cannon, I made a video talking about an interaction between Languid Eye and it being cast twice in quick succession. Even without dropping 2 language, dropping a Destro ultimate and a languid is stronger than basically any other buff we can provide with a mythic. With Crypt Cannon, however, our armor potential is basically dead. Our armor will never reach the cap unless we do some really dumb things. However, it's just what we have to live with. Some things about Crypt Cannon you may not know. Crypt Cannon, or really any light piece, Nirnhoned is stronger than Reinforced, so if you want some more armor, make of that what you will. Crypt Cannon is not treated like an ultimate for a lot of things in this game. For things like Battle Roar, War Machine, and Saxhleel, you will actually not be able to proc these with Crypt Cannon. Finally, we get to the monster set. We will be using Archdruid, which is a great buff on a set that barely works. Well, it's not Archdruid that doesn't actually work, it's just how it interacts with terrain, basically making this one of the most annoying sets ever made. But let's talk about the proc first. Archdruid gives you major vulnerability, which you will not be able to get from any other source, as the DPS don't want to have to slot a Colo just to get this buff. And now that that's out of the way, I want to talk about something that Archdruid does that will make this kind of annoying. When you're fighting an enemy that is not on a completely flat surface, Archdruid has a tendency to just decide it wants to look into the ground and do nothing. Along with this, the Archdruid cone is far shorter and wider than you think it is. Tanking CP. As for CP, we'll start off with the blue tree. For CP in the blue tree, we want to just basically set up as a DPS. And if you're taking slightly too much damage, we mitigate it, but typically this is what our blue CP looks like. Almost all of our damage comes from our pre-buff, so we prioritize buffing that as much as we can. As for the red tree, this is a lot more personal preference, but I would always recommend taking expert evasion, as it can just be a free get you out of jail card if you need to dodge something. Past that, there isn't all that much that helps with damage output, so make yourself as tanky as possible with things like fortified and even bracing anchor if you need to block something. Now let's look at our pre-buff bar, boss bar, and our rotation. Let's start off with the pre-buff, and a quick note, we never really took all that much time to figure out which is the best skills to pre-buff and which skill does more than the other, so we just kind of threw things on we were used to using in a pre-buff, so there might be some better skills in place of these, and yeah. Starting off with our pre-buff, let's look at the volley skill. We use the Maelstrom bow. This bow is extremely strong and you can just set it and forget it. Past this though, we don't really use anything else on the tank, as I need to save my wall to proc Olarim, so I only really pre-buff with the bow. Now let's look at Scalding Rune and Trap Beast. If you don't know, these two skills do not fire until something walks on top of them, meaning you can just set them on the ground at the start of your pre-buff, and by the time you have the boss walking in, they'll just go off on the boss, and yeah, you'll get the full duration of them. But past that, we have things like Eruption and Winter's Revenge. Though Winter's Revenge we'll probably never use, Eruption is used just to pre-buff the Minor Brutality, and we just kind of put it anywhere in our actual pre-buff rotation, which we'll talk about later. Finally, there's one last skill I want to go over, which is Razor Caltrops, and why I use Razor versus Anti-Cavalry. Technically speaking, Anti-Cavalry will be more damage. However, I play with hide group effects, meaning I cannot see if my group still has a Boneyard on the ground. Lastly, Mystic Orb is just here for synergy. I doubt it has ever actually made it to the boss walking in, because people see the Mystic Orb synergy and are immediately like, ooh, mine, but you know, it's there in case. Now let's look at our boss fight bar. Our boss fight bar should look like this. Obviously, we run a taunt and it's inner rage. This is mainly for the synergy while the boss runs in, but also it's just a good taunt. Other than that, the only real weird thing here is, yes, our tank runs banner. We found that the DPS running banner lost the most damage out of all the DPS, so we just ended up throwing it on the tank and we saw a bigger number, and that is all that mattered to us. As for that banner, let's talk about that for a second. We put this on the tank, well, because we found the damage loss on a DPS just isn't worth it and you can easily sustain it, so why not? You lose bar space and damage on the tank as a result, however, DPS did more as a group, so that's what we did. For our banner, we use magic damage to increase both of our beams and Languid Eye. The signature script literally doesn't matter in the slightest, and Minor Berserk. The reason the middle script doesn't really matter is because you don't get anything that can really do much for a tank besides the DK class mastery and some other class mastery scripts. And at that point, you're just using it because it's the only thing that maybe provides you anything. Now for the fun part. Here's the rotation on screen. Past that, I'm just going to talk about some of the reasons why I do things the way I do, like why I prioritize pre-buffing skills like Caltrops so late even though the damage from the skill is terrible. Actually, let's start there. Why Razor Caltrops and not Anti-Cavalry Caltrops? Well, it's entirely for my own upkeep of Major Breach. I use hide group effects, and even though my DPS use Graveyard, I don't want to try to pay attention to that and try to figure out where the little blue mist is at all times. But the main reason this is so important for me and why I want Major Breach from these sources is because I want to be able to delay my Elisus cast until we need it. This is because my Elisus is our off balance proc, and I don't want it instantly going off losing our exploiter window. Eruption is where it is mainly because I'm not the smartest person in the world when it comes to damage optimization with this, but it's just here for the minor buff and we can pre-buff it, so there's no real reason not to do it. Minor Brutality follows the same logic as Minor Breach, just using Eruption to keep it up until my Stone Giant cast, but in this case you could delay it a bit farther than I do most of the time. Finally, you may notice I swap a little bit earlier than you would probably assume. I like to swap early because, well, it gives me the peace of mind that I can change it, even though I don't actually think I could switch it fast enough and fix the problem if we did it at the last second, but it's also to get Banner up. My pre-buff continues onto my main boss bar, and Banner is one of the skills I need to cast, so switching early lets me cast Banner and some other things just to make it as easy as possible. And finally, why I cast Stagger early even though I used Eruption earlier as a pre-buff and probably lost a lot of damage. Well, at the end of the day, I just don't want the Stagger Stomp to come out in the middle of a fight when I can actually potentially take a lot of damage. So I just use it here to get rid of the Stomp early. Now let's look at the actual rotation I use. When I start my cast, I taunt and cast Colorless Pool. This is just to get these two casts out of the way. Obviously, you need to taunt him, and Colorless Pool is ranged, so while the boss walks in, you can just cast it. The most important part of your rotation is when you cast Crypt Cannon. Crypt Cannon needs to be at the same point every single time so your DPS can get used to the rotation and when they can cast their ults and when they will get their ults back. I cast this here also to cancel the heavy attack animation with the lightning staff to get a faster proc of Archdruid. Everything around this, however, is just to get buffs up in a specific order, and the more important buffs go up first. Once everything else is up, this is when I start staggering. At this point, you'll just stagger and keep up buffs if they need to be brought back up. If not, you just probably kill within all of these buffs window and you don't really have to worry about anything else. Now it's time for the part of this video that I cut 90% of it because it ended up taking so long to go over that half of it probably wasn't actually that important. But the tanks are important to this, however, the DPS have really specific things they need to do to make this work. Along with this, the timing for the tank is everything, as we are trying to line up everything with desync and variance. You want to be as consistent as possible as a DPS for your tank. Just like the tank, we'll start out with DPS Subclassing. It's time for the largest shock anyone will ever hear. We use Herald of the Tome. Wow. But we use it specifically to take beam because it's just burstier than everything else basically in the game, and well, we care about nothing else but getting damage out as fast as possible. Let's talk about the two main active skills we'll be using from this line: Pragmatic Fate Carver and Languid Eye. There are other skills we do use, but these are really just the most important things, as most of our damage comes from these two skills. Why do we use a Languid Eye instead of a Dustro Staff ultimate? Well, this is because we were abusing a stacking effect Languid Eye has. If you want more information on this, check the description for my video about Languid Eye being OP, but in short, Languid Eye ramps, and if we cast a second Languid Eye, it continues where the previous Languid Eye's ramp left off. This happens due to an interaction between the Languid Eyes if they are cast simultaneously. Pragmatic, on the other hand, is mainly used because it does the same damage per tick as Exhausting, and basically every single fight in the game we don't need Exhausting. Along with this, Pragmatic gives us a shield to allow us to ignore incoming damage and just stand in it and continue beaming without having to block or do anything weird. Time to look at the second line. The second line we want to look into is Dawn's Wrath. This is strictly for three things. First is Jesus Beam. This should be pretty obvious, but the reason is a bit more important than you may think. Our initial damage is extremely high. However, the second we lose our acuity window, our damage drops to basically nothing in comparison. Jesus Beam eats into this drop and allows us to keep doing damage even after our acuity wins on fights that have a little bit higher health totals. Up next on the list is Solar Barrage. This one is pretty easy. 5% class ability damage, and our top 3 damage skills are all from classes. There's really no point to not have this, as we have some skills doing around 150k DPS on their peak, which is just insane. And finally, there's an extremely important passive that allows us to drop a skill that we would otherwise have to use: Restoring Spirit. This decreases our ultimate cost by 5%, and this makes gaining the second Languid Eye possible by just using light attack ultimate generation. Without this, our rotation wouldn't actually work and it'd be a lot more awkward. We would end up being 2 to 5 ultimate off. This allows our DPS to know for a fact they will get their Languid Eye at the same time without having to worry about making sure Major Heroism and some other stuff are ticking correctly and at the right time. And finally, we have a DPS skill line where none of the actual skills will do any damage. We entirely take this line to keep up passive buffs, and it's Gravelord. Gravelord is, well, extremely strong for us for many reasons, the first of which being the opposite version of Blast Bones, Gravelord's Embrace. This skill increases Languid Eye's damage by a massive 15%, and mix this with the ramp and the rapid drop passive, which is another 10% to dots. We end up with an insane ultimate. Less important, but still nice to have, is Detonating Siphon. 3% damage is one of those things where it's just 3% is 3% and it's to every single skill we're using, so there's really no point to not just find a spot on our bar for it. Finally, for the Gravelord tree, we have a passive that also helps save us from the dreaded we lose our acuity and now we do no damage: Death Knell. Death Knell helps us stem the massive damage loss we have once acuity runs out, giving us 33% critical chance on enemies with 20% health or less. In boss fights with higher health where you aren't killing within the acuity window, this is what you're aiming for to help Jesus Beam do more damage. DPS subclassing options. Really, there's only one: Storm Calling. It's really only for speedrunning, as it's just lower damage for the most part. You mainly take it for streak to get around the map faster. Other than that, however, just like the tank, we have some good pre-buffing skills in Hurricane and Liquid Lightning with the synergy. However, that wouldn't be really the main reason you'd want to use this. It has some decent passives, giving us some good weapon and spell damage with Expert Mage, and you get the reverse execute. Moving on to sets, we have 5-piece sets. Let's start with the obvious, Mechanical Acuity. It gives us a 100% critical chance for around 7 seconds on most builds. This set makes our opening burst insanely high, however you should learn how the set fully works. If you don't know how Mechanical Acuity fully works, I have a video in the description about it. However, here's the short of it. There is a scribing skill known as Soul Burst. With Soul Burst, you can add the signature script Anchorite's Cruelty to do Oblivion damage. And, well, Oblivion damage cannot crit, guaranteeing us a 5th stack of Acuity, effectively increasing its duration by around 2 seconds. This may not seem like a lot, however, any amount of time extra at 100% critical chance is extremely strong. Next up for the 5-piece sets, we have a set that I don't actually think is the best for this, however, in our testing it consistently was, so we use it, Deadly Strike. We don't actually use a trial set for this because most of the trial sets aren't as good. Onslaught is only around a 12% damage increase, technically 19, but you have to interrupt something that we don't want to interrupt, so we'll just not ever get this. And the other set we could compare it to is Coral Riptide. But from our testing, we never actually ended up getting a decent number from Coral Riptide, and it didn't make much sense to us, but we didn't really question anything, and we just went with the set that gave us the bigger number, which ended up being Deadly Strike. Quickly, I want to talk about an option of a trial set, which is Boss's Mania. Boss's Mania is a 15% damage buff, however, it is a light set, and we will be forced to use light pieces, and with how high our weapon spell damage is and percentage increases from medium armor, we just do not want to take this. Up next, we have another very obvious set for our mythic, Velothi. It's just strong. Yes, the Doom Bash Wolf head mythic thing is very strong, but we are beaming and we don't really care about our light attack damage. There are also some fights that you want to be able to hit multiple targets, with the easiest one to think of is Wrath and Maul from Oathsworn's first boss. However, these are kind of few and far between. It's mainly because we just don't light attack for all that much, so who cares? Up next, we have monster sets. We don't use one. Instead, we just use a 1-piece weapon spell damage line. This is just the best option available to us. Finally, we come to the arena weapons. We actually use 3 different arena weapons: the Maelstrom Staff, Maelstrom Bow, and the Master's Bow. Let's start off with the Master's Bow. We drop volley off of our bars, which ends up basically just meaning we do not proc the Berserker glyph automatically. We don't really care, and we just hold our light attacks until the final skill in our back bar and just take the uptime we get. The other reason for this bow, however, is because it's one of the few arena weapons that affects Languid Eye as well as everything else we are doing. This also is in combination with the fact that it just lasts longer than a lot of the other effects you can get from arena weapons, and we just take the Berserker glyph when we can get it, and it just works out for us. To be fair, I'm not saying this reasoning is good. It might not be. We get decent damage out of it. It's weird. It works for us. We don't really care about the Berserker enchant. We get it when we get our nuke, and that's all that matters for us. Now let's talk about the other two, and starting off with the staff. We don't actually know if pre-buffing this works. It looks like it does in logs and whatnot, but yeah, we just don't know. We never really took the time to do the math with it. Next up, it's the Maelstrom Bow. The reason we use this is because volley is just extremely strong, and it ends up making our volley usually the highest pre-buff dot we have. If not, it's in the top 2 almost every single time. So yeah, that's the reason we use that. I lied. We aren't actually done with sets. There's still one poor person who doesn't get to be a full parse, and they have to run War Machine. Past that, it's just putting War Machine on, and they don't do anything separately. They do the same thing everyone else does. It's just for Major Slayer because the tank can't do it. As for DPS CP, when we are looking at the blue CP, we don't actually take direct damage most of the time. Languid Eye is our highest damaging skill, and our pre-buff isn't something to laugh at, so we end up doing AoE and dot damage. Languid Eye just does enough damage that it's worth only buffing Languid. And with Pragmatic and Jesus Beam, well, Jesus Beam doesn't get buffed at all, but Pragmatic gets buffed by the AoE effect. Along with this, we take Wrathful Strikes and Exploiter. This just gives us coverage on every type of damage we have, and during our off balance window, Exploiter is just, Exploiter is probably one of the strongest effects you can have if you can time off balance correctly. Before going over bar setups and anything like that, I want to talk about how we get to the crit cap and how we get to the penetration cap. Starting off with the more important of the two is the critical damage cap. We ended up using the Shadow Mundus and 2 axes with the Dark Elf race instead of a Khajiit. This just gets us to 125% critical damage without having to think about anything else. We do lose swords or the Warrior Mundus, but we don't really care. As for penetration, we get there with Major Breach, Minor Breach, Piercing CP, Velothi, 3 Herald of the Tome skill abilities, and then Gravelord's Dismember passive. But these 2 caps are extremely important to hit, as they're probably our largest increase to just raw damage, as penetration can very easily lower your damage if you're not actually paying attention to what it's doing. Time for the DPS skill bars and rotations, and let's start off like the tank with the pre-buff bar. This remains the same as a tank, however you are pre-buffing up to the last second, and for the most part nothing much changes. You just want to prioritize volley, getting out as late as possible and getting the most damage out of it. You're still following the longer dots first, shorter dots later. But here's what our pre-buff bars look like. It's set up how I would like casting things. If you just need to move stuff, go ahead and do that. A note for spiders though, we don't care about the synergy at all. As long as the explosion goes off on the boss, that's the part we care about, and it just takes 10 seconds to go off, so make sure the boss is on top of your pre-buff 10 seconds after you cast spiders. This is your boss fight bar. We actually have a lot of our pre-buff here just because a lot of our skills are required to stay on your bar between setups, and they are more important than anything you could really pre-buff. I have a tip for this actually. If you want to be super specific about it, you can gain 2 pre-buff skills, but it's not that important. If you want to gain 2 pre-buff skills, you can technically make 2 setups where the first one has Scalding Rune and Trap Beast. As you run into the fight, place these and then swap to your actual pre-buff, and you have 2 extra skills because these will just sit on the ground. Here's the rotation on screen, and let's talk about some of the choices we make. Not really about the skills themselves, but our rotation. Like the tank, we didn't really test skills individually to see which ones fully outperformed each other, but generally speaking, these are what the skills we used. This is one of those things that we just looked at as damage is damage, and we didn't take too much time to optimize which skill did 1% more damage in a pre-buff situation. Let's start off by looking at rotation after the pull actually. We poison inject into Languidi into 2 flails back into a Languid. The main goal is to give our tank time to get stuff up while letting our off balance window, beam, and the second Languid all line up together. Doing 2 flails in between also gives Crypt a chance to actually get to you because they have a bit of a travel time and they take a second to get to their targets. Depending on the boss, you may have to move Jesus Beam back for another rotation of flails and beams, as you might just not be close enough to execute point. The biggest thing to note about pre-buffing as a DPS is Gravelord Sacrifice needs to be late enough that both of your Languidis get their full duration off during the buff. Recasting Gravelords is a massive waste, and you'll never actually want to do that in the fight itself. One last thing to note as a DD for pre-buffing is things like Quick Cloak, Solar Barrage, and Simmering Frenzy need to stay on your bar and in the exact same slot, or they will be removed when you swap gear. This is the reason you see these skills on our pre-buff bar and our main boss bar. Things like Simmering Frenzy just need the time to actually ramp, but things like Solar Barrage, if you move them, then it just dies, and since we're swapping at the last second, you have to pre-buff them. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed, and for this last little bit, I'm going to mainly be talking about 2 add-ons we use and some smaller tips with them. We use Wizard's Wardrobe to set swap and skill swap quickly. Wizards, if you haven't used it, is a fickle little thing that doesn't break anywhere near as much as it used to, but it's still known to just not swap certain things whenever it just kind of feels like it. What we found to help mitigate this is swapping from one weapon to another within the same class, so a bow to a bow or dual wield to dual wield, makes it so that it swaps a lot easier and it doesn't break as often. Another thing is it doesn't like it if you're blocking while swapping, so make sure to not do that. Another add-on we heavily use is Hodor's Reflexes, but not for the DPS tracker. Though we do use that mainly to make fun of the person who misses their ultimate and just laugh at them, but the real reason we use it is because of a timer. In your key bindings with Hodor's, you can set a key binding to start a timer. But that's all for this video. I spent way too much time re-editing and re-scripting this video. I wanted to originally get it out last year, but that didn't happen. This video took me far longer than I thought it would, and it's really kind of interesting as this setup works on every fight in the game that doesn't have, 30 million health, but you do have to also just learn the fights or play RNG forever to figure out how it works. There's a lot of things with nuking bosses where you have to learn what mechanics get them stuck in animations and how to abuse them. And then there's also times like the Stonehawk and Naj where it's just completely RNG if he does the mechanic order you want and if he'll actually delay enough to where you can get the kill on him. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed and thanks for watching.